and good day to everyone. My name is Kyle Garland, and I'm with the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOW. Think JSOW is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of JSOW faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOW collection by reviewing our online offerings on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the All Partner Access Network, or APAN. Today, we are honored to have Colonel Andrew Milburn join us to discuss his book titled, When the Tempest Gathers, From Mogadishu to the Fight Against ISIS, a Marine Special Operations Commander at War. Colonel Milburn was born in Hong Kong and grew up in the United Kingdom. After graduating law school from the University of Westminster, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps as a private. He was commissioned from the ranks, and as a Marine Infantry and Special Operations Officer, he is commanded in combat at every grade. As the commanding officer of the Marine Corps Special Operations Regiment, he was selected to lead a multinational task force given the mission of defeating ISIS in Iraq. He retired in 2019 as the Chief of Staff of Special Operations Command Central, or SOC-CENT, which is the headquarters responsible for the conduct of all U.S. special operations throughout the Middle East. Colonel Milburn, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Kyle. Thank you for the interview.
Your book chronicles your experiences from a new second lieutenant to colonel and describes leading Marines through the streets of Mogadishu, Baghdad, Fallujah, and Mosul. The book culminates with your experiences as a combined and joint special operations task force commander while directing multinational special operations forces in a complex fight against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. It's really a very good book, and I feel it puts the reader right in the middle of combat situations. But sir, before we discuss your book, I'd like to ask you, the first question here is, why did you choose to write this book?
Well, Kyle, I honestly didn't really choose to write a book to begin with. I came back from my last deployment, which, as you mentioned, was the counter-ISIS fight, commanding the siege of Sodef in Iraq, made up of, as you put out, all special operations components and 8 different countries. It was a tremendously rewarding deployment, but it was also a tremendously painful deployment for a number of reasons that we'll probably talk about in this interview. So I came back from that. I had, honestly, probably some accumulated, I would say, for want of a better word, combat stress over multiple deployments, like many people do.
Right.
I had suffered a family tragedy. I had lost my daughter immediately prior to the deployment. So cumulatively, I had probably needs to find some kind of outlet or escape. So I found that writing was totally absorbing. While I was writing, I couldn't think about anything else, and I really enjoyed doing it. My initial intent was to write something down that my children could read about later in life, to see why I was away for so much of their lives. Before I knew it, almost before I knew it, within 3 months, I had something like 100,000 words. And so I had essentially the manuscript for a book, and I contacted an old friend, Bing West, who some of the listeners may have heard from various books that he has written. And he recommended that I submit the manuscript. For anyone who's watching this, who is thinking about writing a book, I absolutely encourage you to do so. But I also advise you to be prepared for multiple rejections. You've got to have a thick skin. And I lost count of the number of publishers who turned the manuscript down. There was a glut of combat memoirs on the market. And by 2018, really no one wanted to read about the war, maybe outside the military, which is a fairly small audience. So most publishers just simply were not interested. And it was a publisher that specialized in military history, Pen and Sword, who took the book on. And I'd like to say it has actually done surprisingly well for a combat memoir. You know, it seems to have appeal far outside the military community. You mentioned one thing, Kyle. You said, you know, the story of leading Marines, and it is a story to begin with of leading Marines, but and I think you agree to this too. It's really a universal story about what it's like to fight America's wars, regardless of service. You know, even as early as a major in Iraq, I led soldiers and sailors as well as Marines. So I'd like to think that it's agnostic as to service. For the special operations community, when I got to the part about the Siege of Soda fight against Iraq, I was very proud of what all of my men and women had done within that task force, regardless of nationality, regardless of service component. I thought it was a tremendous story, how cumulatively over a succession of deployments, 4 or 5 Siege of Sodas really were instrumental in causing the downfall of ISIS in northern Iraq. It was a team effort. Don't get me wrong on that. But the special operations forces contributed probably the bulk to the bulk of that victory. I mean, I would hope no one would argue with that, just because of the authorities and permissions and the expertise that special operations forces had. And I wanted to get that story out. I was a little concerned about classification issues because a lot of the stuff that we were doing there, as you read in the book, working with the populations of territory that was under ISIS, a form of UW basically, and also some of the targeting techniques we were using, signals intelligence. And so the book did go through a pretty rigorous scrub at the Pentagon, 9 months. But I've got to say, in fairness to DOD, there was hardly anything redacted from that. And, you know, I'm very, very grateful to the Pentagon, to the community for not doing that, because I think it's an important story.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear that they didn't take out too much. But Colonel Milburn, having read the book, I'm an ex-military guy. I can understand why it's doing well. It was really a fascinating read.
Well, no, thank you. That's been a gratifying aspect of having the book published. I would like to think that there isn't there's no kind of chest pounding element of this. In fact, the Marine Corps Gazette was kind enough to say that this is not a self-promoting memoir. It's painfully honest. And I absolutely tried to write about the way things were rather than the way I wish they had been, to include all my mistakes that I've made. And one thing that I found tremendously gratifying is the flood of emails and messages from military mostly veterans, but civilians too, but mostly veterans, all services, and guys and girls who haven't known me, just saying thank you, basically, for telling my story. Thank you. You know, this is a book that I can give to my family, my kids, or have my wife read and say, hey, this is what it was like. You know, you ask me what it's like. I haven't been able to talk about it, or I haven't talked about it. And that's been really gratifying. I'm glad that it was that so many people feel that it was a universal representation of their experience.
Yeah, well, you got the story out. Plus, as you mentioned, you used it as a form of therapy for yourself. So that's really good to hear. Well, thanks, Colonel Milburn. Your route into the United States Marine Corps is really quite a bit different than most recruits. As I mentioned earlier, you were raised in the United Kingdom. You were attending and graduated law school. I'm curious, sir, what motivated you to join the United States Marine Corps as opposed to maybe joining the British forces or even practicing law?
Well, now the story can be told. Actually, my first choice was to join the British military, and I was rejected. I had a serious injury from playing rugby while at university. So yes, my plan was to get a commission actually within Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, it was called. Back then, you applied within the British Army specifically to a regiment. You got sponsored by a regiment. I don't know if it is still the same way. And so I was always planning to go into the military. My degree was in philosophy, which doesn't really equip you well for any job. Actually, it's not a very common degree for someone going to the military either, come to think of it.
Right.
But so that was my plan. I was rejected by the British, and I had U.S. citizenship courtesy of my mother. I was a dual national, and while I was at law school, I failed in an exam, had to take a year off, and traveled around the world. I traveled. It's kind of now it seems like an extraordinary story. I got a transit visa for Iran. This was back in '87 when Iran was at war with Iraq, and had some experiences in Iran, to include being arrested and being caught in an Iraqi air raid of all things. Very ironic, considering some of my later experiences. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I ended up in the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad to pick up my U.S. passport, which my parents had mailed ahead. Ran into Marine security guards in the embassy, and those of you are listeners or watchers who know about Marine security guards know that they live a pretty privileged life. It's a tough assignment, but they live courtesy of the State Department in pretty sumptuous surroundings, not typical of the Marine Corps. But I was impressed by that. I was thinking, these guys live a great life, and they exuded good health and discipline. And I thought this would be a good sabbatical. 4 years after law school, I'll do this, and then I'll go back to the UK and practice law. So when I got back to London, there was actually a Marine recruiter in London, US Marine recruiter. This was the 80s, so there were US high schools across Europe. And I was probably his only quota for 1987. I'm sure he's still laughing about that. And so, yeah, I graduated law school and enlisted in the Marine Corps as a private. I was guaranteed PFC out of boot camp. And my parents were unimpressed by that, and it took them a few years to forgive me.
Well, you obviously succeeded, because you were commissioned shortly after you were enlisted. And that ties into my next question. Early in your book, you talk about your experiences in Somalia. When you were a junior officer, you were leading Marines on what turns out to be life and death missions in very dangerous places. So I think back to my own military career and my maturity level and experience when I was a junior officer. So I'd like to ask you, how did you cope with the pressures? And did you feel adequately prepared for this really awesome responsibility of taking Marines in dangerous locations?
I think, and this isn't propaganda on behalf of the Marine Corps, but the Marine Corps did an extraordinarily good job of preparing us for the pressures of leadership. Now, there are a couple of things that, and this is not the fault of the institution. When I was a lieutenant going through basic officer training, every single Marine officer goes through the same school, a 6-month school called we call the basic school. And the value of that is, I didn't realize until afterwards, but it's tremendous value. If you think about it, regardless of MOS, of occupational speciality, even pilots, all of us have that same grounding, are trained as to be a rifle platoon commander. And then you go on to a specialty school. So I went on to the infantry officer course. Where I'm heading on this is, I was very, very well prepared to lead Marines. I was prepared to lead them in stressful situations. I would say the only thing that I was not prepared for was the type of war that we found ourselves fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. That a lot of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we learned as lieutenants were based on the previous war, were based on Vietnam. We learned a lot about jungle warfare and light infantry tactics, not necessarily about the war we were going to fight. Now, I would say, Kyle, that there is one proviso to what I just said. Somalia was an extraordinary situation, particularly the time that I was there. It was several months before the infamous Black Hawk Down, Task Force Ranger situation or scenario, incident, but still it was a fraught, dangerous environment in Mogadishu itself, and especially where my platoon was on the Green Line, which was a demarcation between two warring clans. Where I'm heading on this is that the rules of engagement they weren't attuned to that sort of environment. It was a humanitarian mission, and the rules of engagement were designed such for that. So it was difficult as a platoon commander, a junior officer, to lead Marines on security patrols and do things that we need to do, which was provide security for the port. But at the same time, we weren't allowed to disarm gunmen, for instance. So it was that particular situation was not one that I was frankly well prepared for. It was a steep learning curve.
Yeah, I bet. Well, sir, what I'd like to do now is just fast forward a few years into your career. And I'm going to ask you a question about when you were attending the Marine Corps War College. Sir, you wrote a paper that was titled Breaking Ranks, Dissent, and the Military Professional, where you argued that under certain circumstances, a military officer is obligated to disobey orders, even legal orders. And I'd like you, sir, to, if you could, please clarify when this is appropriate. And I'd also like to ask if you have any examples from your own career when you did this.
Certainly. Now, I also wrote another article recently published in War on the Rocks entitled Knowing When to Disobey or When to Disobey Orders. And in that, I think I clarified, I hope I clarified a little better the article that I wrote in 2010. Although, rereading the article in 2010, I don't think the only thing that I would de-emphasize in that is when I talk about the nexus between the policy and military strategy. I think the reason why that article became so controversial is that people would read the first few paragraphs and then say, hey, this guy is challenging civilian control of the military, which is one of the bedrocks, of course, of our democracy. And so it caused a huge furor, to include calls for me to resign my commission by various academic pundits. Fortunately, the Marine Corps kept me on. But to your point, Kyle, I don't think that this topic is as controversial as some people make out. We belong to a profession. You and I and all of us in the military. Our oath is to the Constitution. It's not to any single administration. Any profession has its own code of ethics. We have an obligation to the nation writ large, which sometimes is hard to define, right? But that is our obligation. And we have an obligation to our subordinates too. And it's implicit, in the tremendous authority we have over our subordinates, literally life or death. There's very few other professions where you can say that, but we do. We're entrusted with America's youth. And they, by the way, when they take their oath of office, unlike us as officers, they promise to obey us. They swear to obey us. So what I'm saying in these articles, again, shouldn't be controversial to anyone who holds a commission. That is, there is a gap between receipt of order and execution, right? There's always, and that gap is your judgment. That gap is, anyone who disputes that reduces a military officer to being an automaton. We already admit that with our doctrine of mission command. If you believe in mission command, you understand that you exercise your judgment in that gap. If you see a better way to accomplish the mission, or the means that to accomplish the mission that you've been given, no longer will achieve that purpose, then mission command says you're free to essentially disobey that order. And I'm saying exactly the same thing with reference to a professional ethics. If in consulting your professional ethics, you believe that order violates those, then you have an obligation to disobey it. Not controversial. I'll give you some examples, all right? If you're given an order that will undoubtedly result in casualties and to no clear purpose, then again, hard call, but in some cases that's going to mean that you either question the order or if an extremist, disobey it. Now, I'm not saying you do that without any repercussions. You have to have the moral courage to accept any repercussions that come your way, because again, you know, the military depends to some extent absolutely on obedience. So if you violate that, it has to be a good reason. It isn't simply because you didn't feel like obeying that order. It's because upon consulting your professional ethics. You asked me for some examples, okay? All right. Think about Coalition Provisional Authority Order Number 1, passed by CPA in 2003, that disbanded the Iraqi army. And it is a de-Baathification order. Now, those of us in the military in Iraq at the time knew that that was likely to be disastrous, to make unemployed over 100,000 Iraqi males between the ages of 18 and 40, make them absolutely not just take away their job, their profession, but make them unemployable with their weapons, trained for combat. Of course, you know, that was a significant contributor to the insurgency. There were senior officers who disobeyed that order in various parts of Iraq. You know, obviously I'm not going to mention them in the interview, but they were. Now, would you say they were wrong? You know, they were in a particular, say if you're a division commander and you are just getting a city under control and you're getting the services up and running with the help of a former Iraqi military, and then suddenly you get this order to fire them all, and you know that once you do that, not only your soldiers' lives are going to be at risk, but you're essentially plunging yourself into a counterinsurgency. Are you going to obey that order? That's a great example. Anyone who just says, yes, it's an order, I will obey it, that concerns me. You know, that's not, I would argue that is not what we expect of a U.S. military officer.
That's a very good explanation. So I appreciate you clarifying that for us.
Enhanced interrogation. Was it a legal order or was it illegal order? It was only later that it was determined by the Supreme Court to be illegal.
Right.
But there again, there is an example that these things are not black and white.
Absolutely.
And you can't just simply say, hey, that was an order, I got to obey it. That's not why you hold a commission. If that is all that it took to hold a commission, then why do we make such a big deal about being an officer?
Right.
You see what I'm saying about, to me, it's uncontroversial. But honestly, most of those in the military, those of us who wear uniform, understand this. The furor that arose when I wrote these articles mostly came from academic pundits. By the way, most of whom avoided going to Vietnam or joining the military in the first place, so it couldn't be expected.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. Next question, sir. In March of 2015, during your pre-deployment training, you experienced a professional tragedy when you lost 7 Marines that were assigned to the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion during a helicopter accident in the panhandle of Florida. As the regimental commander and the commander of the Siege of Soda, and you're already in your spin-up training, can you discuss how you were able to handle this situation and keep your unit focused on the mission?
Yes, and so to begin with, I do want to say it was a collective effort. Of course, I had leaders all the way down between me and the team who suffered those casualties, who balanced empathy, compassion with the understanding that we still had to get that company ready for deployment within a few weeks, frankly. It was that was a particular blow to the community. It was a personal blow to me because, you know, when you're a regimental commander, you have, you know, the MARSOC regiment is relatively small back then. It was just over 1,000 guys. You don't know everyone though, right? Any regimental commander doesn't necessarily, but I did know this team particularly well, and it was a personal blow. One of the decisions that as a commander you find yourself constantly making is, where should I be? And someone explained this to me. It's not always, it's not it's not a direct guide, but it is a good rule of thumb. And that is, think about things that only you can do. That's where you should be. And if it's something that someone else subordinate to you can do, then leave it to them. Now that may seem very simple, but it's actually not. But it nevertheless is a guide. Where I'm heading on this is when I received word of that crash, the choice was, do I go there to the point of the accident, or do I remain in Camp Lejeune? And I chose to go to Destin. It wasn't a decision driven by impulse or just simple reaction to a tragedy. It was based on a little bit of deliberation and the fact that I knew that I had guys back in Camp Lejeune, the whole chain of command at MARSOC. I had an extremely capable XO who could handle all of the things that needed to be done there. But there at the point where the accident had occurred, and remember at that time we still had missing Marines, that is where I felt I needed to be. And I was very glad that I made that decision. I made a lot of decisions that, just like most commanders can look back and say, made decisions that didn't work out for the best, but this one did. It was one of the worst things about this tragedy, one of the worst aspects, and there were many just dreadful aspects of this accident. But the news broke as I was traveling out to Destin. So the families heard of what had happened, that there had been a crash, and they could put two and two together, and they knew they hadn't heard from their loved ones before DOD was in a position to notify them what had happened. They saw it on television. It was, you can imagine, having suffered a tragedy myself, a dreadful way for them to get that news. The community back at MARSOC came together, and as it always does, to console them as best they could, but these Marines were still missing. There at the point of the accident, the bodies were being recovered, but we were in a position like the families that we knew what had happened to their loved ones. I mean, it was just where I'm heading on this, Kyle, is that because the chain of command at MARSOC was really leaning forward. I had this total support of my boss, General Osterman, who managed to get permission for me to identify the bodies there in Destin at the morgue, which was unprecedented. Before they had a chance to do DNA confirmation, and being able to do that meant that we could inform the families. We could give them the worst news, but we could take them out of that awful limbo of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. So, but it was for all of us. It was obviously it was worse than losing guys in combat, and I can't explain exactly why, but it was somehow infinitely worse.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, sir, I can only imagine that the helicopter accident and the loss of those 7 Marines must have been one of, if not the most difficult leadership challenge that you had to deal with in your professional career. Sir, can I ask you, can you describe some other leadership challenges that you faced specifically while leading Marines in combat?
Yes, certainly. What I like to do, Carl, is I'll begin by saying one of the, obviously the toughest thing you have to do when leading Marines in combat is the constant balance between mission and risk, and knowing when or not knowing when, you don't know, but making the decision of when pushing to the limits of what I would call the precipice is justified by the mission. Now, you hear people say, well, it's the mission and the men, this is simple. And usually those people who just simply spout that have never had to balance this constantly, especially in combat. I'll give you a couple of examples. So in Anbar province, at any given time, if you were a battalion commander, you were having to make decisions about the purpose of sending out patrols, right? And every area within Anbar province varied. So in some areas, pushing out patrols made perfect sense, simply to, and I hate this term, to kind of show presence to the locals, to gather intelligence, to keep the insurgents on the back foot. In other areas, it was so bad where you were taking casualties every time you pushed out a patrol, then there were commanders who would only they would still send out patrols. Everyone knows that you can't hunker down on your fob, but they would do so only intelligence-driven patrols. So those patrols would have a very specific mission, perhaps to go after or to conduct a raid or to go after certain people. But their tempo of patrols might be lower. Those are the sort of decisions that a commander has to make. Am I being too passive? Am I being too aggressive? And as you know, in a counterinsurgency, there's no simple answer to that question. It varies from area to area. There is no playbook. We can read whatever books you like about counterinsurgency. We have a great doctrinal manual on counterinsurgency, but those things are only general guides. And in the end, as a commander on the ground, you are making those decisions all the time. That is a challenge that all commanders face. For me, in particular, I'll just give you two examples. In Mosul, I talk about this in my book. In Mosul, as an advisor, this is in early 2005, after the Battle of Fallujah, collectively what the coalition found after the Battle of Fallujah was that it had not been the set-piece victory that everyone had hoped for. Zarqawi had escaped, and hundreds of insurgents had escaped. And frankly, the news coverage of an Iraqi city being rubbled, and bear in mind, I fought in that battle, so this isn't just an empty critique. I was very proud to have been fought in the Battle of Fallujah. It was a well-planned operation, but nevertheless, in the end, as the second and third order consequences were that it did not slow the insurgency down. In fact, it's a matter of record that attacks increased across Iraq after the Battle of Fallujah. Many of the insurgents fled Fallujah, went elsewhere in the country, and as I said, the spate of recruitment went up rather than down. And so Mosul was one of those places. Mosul became some of the people watching this video may remember Mosul in early 2005. The 101st Airborne Division, who had great success there under General Petraeus, left in 2004, leaving a single striker brigade there. And a combination of events occurred in early 2005. There were a flood of insurgents into Mosul. The police, the Iraqi police, and the security forces there simply evaporated. Single striker brigade there, and they suffered the single worst attack on coalition forces to date in the war, when a bomb detonated in Camp Morez. I forget the number of casualties. I do remember that the number of wounded was 70 or 80. I believe that there were 20 or so killed. So it was all these events happening at once. And so into this situation comes a brigade of the Iraqi army, brand new brigade of the Iraqi army, with a collection of advisors. Now, this is very early on in the war, and the Army and the Marine Corps were throwing together advisor teams without much opportunity to really select guys or to train them. And so the advisor team that went up with this Iraqi brigade was composed 50% Army, 50% Marines. Now, the Army guys, and think about it, this mission would be well suited for special forces. That's essentially, it was combat advising. And it was combat advising a unit known as the Iraqi Intervention Force, who were former Iraqi Republican Guard Special Forces guys. So they were fairly capable, or at least they had the grounding to do well, but they needed American US enablers and mentors to accompany them. The Army, for whatever reason, chose to put reservists in as advisors. And these guys, super guys, but just aren't prepared to be thrust into urban combat in that type of role. And on the Marine side, and this isn't me just spouting propaganda as a Marine. I think the Marine Corps did a pretty good job selecting guys with combat experience. But as you know, and many of your listeners know, a good Marine, good soldier does not necessarily make a good advisor. Different skill sets, right? That's why the Green Berets are who they are, and that's why they have a selection process. Anyway, so one of these, and you've read the books, you know this story, but one of the battalion advisor team leaders, an Army major, quit when we got to Mosul. Simply said, I'm done doing this. This isn't what I signed up for. And I was deputized and placed in his position. He was a popular guy. He was until that point, had been a good officer, loved by his guys. That team was half Army, half Marine, and he'd looked after them, but he just had enough. And so being thrust into the center of Mosul in taking over this team in an Iraqi police station, I compare it to taking over a 7th Cavalry outpost in the Badlands of North Dakota, with a semi-mutinous garrison. And that's what it seemed. That's what it seemed like. Now, to your point, though, our mandate was to get ready for the elections, and that seemed like a tall order. Even the Iraqis the Iraqi soldiers did not want to go out in the streets. And half of my advisors were telling me, this is too dangerous. We don't have the backup that we need. We don't have armored vehicles. This is basically a suicidal mission. I'm not exaggerating. That is the term that was used to me. But nevertheless, I had a mandate, and during the Marine, I was programmed to, and I'm not saying that was wrong. I'm just simply saying that was kind of my ethos. But at the same time, because I'm also a leader, and I understand my responsibilities to subordinates, it was a constant deliberation for me of, okay, am I pushing the limit too much? Am I risking the lives of my guys unnecessarily, such that I'm going to get these guys killed and wounded to no end? So again, that gets back to the balance between mission and risk. I knew that I could not simply hunker down in that police station. We would make ourselves targets. And I knew too that we did have a mission. We were there to provide security for the elections. But at the same time, I had to take a common sense approach, and I was dealing, frankly, with borderline mutiny at any given time if I pushed too hard. So that was a tremendous challenge. I didn't have the hierarchy around me that you have in a conventional U.S. unit, where you are living on a FOB, and you've got a chain of command above you to support you, and you've got NCOs who will back you up. It was literally leading by force of personality, which sounds easy to do, but is not in that situation.
The decisions that you were making, not only in this particular situation, but in others, the gravity of the decisions was just incredible.
Kyle, if you've got time, I've got one other example.
Absolutely.
So as a battalion commander in Anbar province, in probably the worst place in Anbar province. Anbar province was not known for being a gentle part of Iraq, let me put it that way. And there's one place in Anbar province called Karma. Ironically, within Karma, unbeknownst to me at the time, the Al-Qaeda contingent there had just been taken over by one dude named al-Baghdadi, who subsequently became obviously the leader of the Islamic State. And my predecessor, a good friend of mine, battalion commander, was killed in Karma in a suicide bomb by what became kind of the cadre for the Islamic State. Well, as you may remember, 2008, 2009, things started to settle down in Iraq. It really looked as though the end might be in sight, and plans were afoot to turn the responsibility for security over to the Iraqi government. And so province by province, the US military was doing exactly that. Within our Anbar province, our mandate was to really put the Iraqi police and army in the fore and to take a step back. In Karma, which had been such a bad area, that was no easy task, and it was a constant reappraisal of how much I could afford to do that without losing gains, and then turning the balance back to the insurgency. And so we continued to push out patrols. We did accompany the Iraqis on them, and we pushed them, not pushed them, but led them as much as possible. But nevertheless, again, I realized that I was putting my guys still at risk when the Iraqi army and security forces and police should be stepping up to the forefront and taking that risk. But at the same time, I felt that it was a balanced, deliberate decision, and that to step back too abruptly would simply turn things back to the insurgents. And we took casualties as a result. And that is not an easy thing for a commander to know, that you are taking casualties directly related to decisions that you have made.
Exactly.
You could have avoided them. Those are tough. Those are tough decisions. So it's all very well being a commander and having your name on a coffee cup and having a parking space reserved for you. But that's one of the downsides, is indeed that burden, and that sense that not only do you know that, but of course everyone else knows that, and you've got to live with that.
Right. Absolutely. Well, sir, as I read through your book, I was astounded by how often you were deployed. It just read that you were always gone. So I'd like to ask you, can you share how you balance your family with your career?
Not as well as I should have, Kyle. I think that my experience, I would guess, is universal. So many of those in uniform deployed frequently and found themselves trying to strike that right balance. And a friend of mine worded it very well to me. He said, the problem is that you can't fill all the roles in your life equally well, especially if you're in the military period, but especially if you're an officer or an NCO and you're a leader. You can't be everything that you need to be and look after your subordinates and deploy the way that you deploy and be the husband and the father that you want to be at the same time. It's just not possible. And I think that, again, for the knowledge of that, the knowledge that it isn't possible doesn't absolve you from feeling guilt about not being able to meet all of those roles. So yeah, I think, but again, this is, I think, a universal feeling for a lot of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with members of United States Special Operations Command, where our ops tempo rate is quite a bit higher than what I would consider with the other services.
Very much so. Yeah.
Well, sir, I'll get back to your book, and I really do appreciate the way you wrote your book, and because you described, like you said, not only your achievements but also some of your challenges. And I want to ask you a question that has a little bit to do with ethics. You described a situation where an enemy combatant was captured, and the men in your unit, to include you, and I appreciate your honesty in this, is that you had feelings that you wanted to do something bad to this prisoner because of the members of your unit that he had either wounded or possibly killed. So this is definitely an ethical dilemma. Can you describe the scenario and discuss how it was resolved, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Carl, there's two such scenarios in the book. One is an incident in Fallujah where 2 Marines were killed. I write, and this was without exaggeration, probably about 10 feet from me. And then within 10, 15 minutes, the 2 insurgents who had killed them were captured by the unit that I was attached to. And there's a very quick transfer from extreme shock, anger to extreme, shock and grief to extreme anger. Right. And it doesn't matter. I've seen this activated in people, the most mild-mannered and well-educated people. I have advanced degrees. I've got degrees in philosophy and law, and I'm still subject to those emotions. So you can imagine if you're an 18-year-old without that grounding, that moral safety net, and you are subjected to that kind of situation. It really emphasizes for me the importance of leadership to play the role in that, and being unequivocal in upholding moral standards. I used to, and that isn't airy-fairy stuff. That's coming from someone who's lived this. I used to tell my Marines, listen, we fight with the values that we represent. We don't adopt those of the enemy. If you forget that, then we may as well not be here. We're going to plunge ourselves down a very slippery slope, and we become no better than our enemies. And then all of our losses become meaningless. We're not fighting for anything. And so holding on to that is easier said than done. But to me, it's unequivocal. There can be no compromise. There absolutely can be no, well, they do that sort of thing. No, absolutely not. That is why, again, why holding a commission or wearing a uniform in the United States military means so much. And so that was one incident. The other incident involved not Americans. It involved Iraqi soldiers. And I remember I was an advisor, not necessarily commanding them, but nevertheless, you have an obligation as an advisor. As special operations guys, we are very familiar with this quandary to uphold the law of armed conflict. In this particular case, my Iraqi soldiers, the guys I was advising, captured a sniper who had caused a number of casualties, to include the death of a very popular soldier. And it's quite uncommon to catch a sniper. They did. And so there is a scene in the book where they obviously want to do him harm. They know, as did I, that if they turned him over to the Iraqi authorities, he would disappear into the court system and would be out on the streets within weeks, and would probably find another weapon and get back to work. So there seem to be pragmatic reasons as well as emotional reasons just to kill this guy. But again, I know that once you allow that, once you take a step, it doesn't matter what arguments you use to justify it at the time. You've let yourself and your guys start down a very slippery slope that really has no end, and will in the end engulf you. And the other part about this is I'm in contact, obviously, with a number of Marines who are dealing with I say obviously because I think no one goes through combat without being untouched by it, but I know a number of Marines who are struggling with guilt for having pulled the trigger at the wrong time and killed the wrong people. And a number of those cases was because their commanders had told them, either explicitly or implicitly, it's okay. If you feel your life's at danger, pull the trigger at, and so they were perhaps a little too quick to do that, and at a checkpoint or a roadblock, certainly in the early days of the war, and killed the wrong people, and now have to live with that. Psychological casualties we know there are such things, psychological casualties, and moral casualties contribute to psychological casualties. That has been my experience, and it's commander's role, for all the reasons I've given, also to protect his subordinates from incurring those moral casualties.
Well, very well said. Thank you very much. Well, thanks again, Colonel Milburn. I'd like to ask you, if you had to pick one event, what would you say would be your greatest professional achievement during your 30-year career?
Leading the Siege of Sotif, it was an extraordinary experience. For a number of reasons. One is that it was the first time that a Marine had had the opportunity to lead a task force of that size. So, there was some pressure involved. But the experience was extraordinary for a number of reasons. One was there was no real template for this particular Sijah Sodif. It was stood up in a sense in extremis. If you remember, in early 2016, the Islamic State was just 30 miles from Baghdad and held an area that was, I mean, the size of the United Kingdom in Iraq and Syria, almost a third of Iraq and I believe over a third of Syria. And, now perhaps easy to forget that the Islamic State, at least the physical caliphate, is no more, but 2016 was the period 2014 to 2016 was a bad time. So having to stand up a Sijah Sodif, there was no, I couldn't just simply take the Marine Special Operations Regiment because there is only one regiment. And so it was an ad hoc organization that we had to stand up, comprising all the services and personnel from 5 different countries within the headquarters. And conventional as well as special operations. So you can imagine having to do that in a fairly short period of time. Also mitigating against us was the fact that we had 6 months to do this, but really it wasn't 6 months because it was during the period of what we call the American Ramadan. It was Thanksgiving and Christmas. And so it was a much significantly shorter period of time. So having to do all of that, and I was fortunate in that I just had some really capable guys on my staff who just came together. With a team that had never worked together before, and then deployed to Iraq to fight a campaign that even within the special operations community, the sort of campaign we had not done that before. To begin with, having to influence our partners, and very disparate partners, from the tribes in Anbar to the Iraqi Special Operations Forces to the Peshmerga, to begin with, without being able to accompany them and deal with all the political sensitivities within that country that were every bit as difficult to deal with as the Islamic State, to deal with a chain of command that was not the chain of command, particular command relationships that were quite convoluted, and very top-heavy headquarters above us. I think it was Andrew Lumpkin, who was at the time ASD Solik, said, paraphrasing Churchill, "Never in the field of human conflict have so few being led by so many." And so having a headquarters comprising some 1,000 people above me wasn't necessarily always helpful. And so dealing with all those things, plus having having to stand up additional forces, or write a request for forces to get an additional task force out there, which I judged was necessary. So I would have a Marine and a SEAL task force, plus task forces from 8 different countries, all of whom had different caveats, was an extraordinary task, and not necessarily one I would want to repeat. But that is, to answer your question, that was, yeah.
Well, thank you. I can only imagine the challenges with that. Sarah, I want to ask you one final question about your book before we begin to wrap up. And this is a sensitive topic, but toward the end of your book, you briefly discussed the inner turmoil that you were experiencing following so much combat. And as a result, you stated that the best decision you made was to seek counseling. And of course, this is really an issue with many special operations forces because of the many combat deployments that they experience. So if you wouldn't mind, can you discuss what you were going through and how counseling has helped you cope with that stress?
Yeah, I think, in fairness too, I mean, I was dealing with some grief issues too, but yes, here's the quandary that we all face, and whether you're in the Marine Corps or you just within somewhere else, another component within the special operations community, we say quite rightly, and the community, or all the military community writ large has come a long way in this sense, but we say that it is okay to seek help, and that it is quite common to go through, to have issues relating to your experiences. But at the same time, we can be empathetic towards others, but we still don't want other people to know that we have those problems ourselves, and you think about it, especially those in a leadership position, and you can't help thinking, hey, the guys under me probably, they expect strength. They don't need someone over them who is undergoing any type of psychological turmoil. And that's a tough position to get past. You can understand, you can be the leader that you need to be, and as far as empathetic towards your subordinates who have problems, and taking care of them, and ensuring that the word is out that this is not weakness, because indeed it is not, and that the only healthy way to deal with it really is to seek some type of counseling. But at the same time, it's very difficult to recognize those same problems in yourself, and to acknowledge that. I mean, think about it. We are, from the time we come in through, whether you're enlisted or an officer of basic training, the ethos is quite different, right? Is not to display any type of vulnerability. So that is something I think that we wrestle with. But I do want to say, Kyle, that the special operations community has been extraordinary in how it does take care of its people, whether it's the Care Coalition, whether it's the POTIF programs. You and I probably could not imagine the resources that are available now, and so I've got nothing but admiration for everyone who's involved in that process.
Well, thanks very much for your honesty. I mean, we all know it's a very sensitive topic. Sir, I'd like to ask you another question. If you had one last opportunity to give advice to a auditorium full of special operations forces, what would you say?
In a single sentence, that's a read my book. Insist that the institution distributes the book so that it's free to everyone there. There's honestly, there is no single statement that I can say to that, Carl. But I can say this, that the understanding that good leadership at any level involves self-examination and walking that line between healthy self-criticism, but not paralysis. There always has to be an element of insecurity in good leadership. That is something that frankly would have been a surprise if someone had told me that as a second lieutenant. But it's something that everyone needs to understand. Because I think where people go wrong is that they sometimes think that they have to cover that up, but that it's, we all seek to lead, we all seek to command, but there's a painful self-examination part of that, and that is healthy as long as it doesn't lead to paralysis.
Well, thank you again. Sir, I think we're approaching the end of our time, but before we do sign off, do you have any closing comments you'd like to offer?
No, I can't think of any, Kyle. That's been an excellent interview. You've covered everything.
Well, again, I very much appreciate your honesty with the questions. Well, thank you again very much, Colonel Milburn, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. Your book, When the Tempest Gathers, From Mogadishu to the Fight Against ISIS, a Marine Special Operations Commander at War, in my opinion, it does an exceptional job of explaining the trials and tribulations of combat leadership through your experiences. So thank you very much. For our online audience, if you have any feedback on this session or any Think JSOW activity, please contact us at thinkjsow@socom.mil. I'd like to close by once again encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOW collection by subscribing through the library or on one of our social media channels on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, or APAN. Additionally, the USSOCOM library is an exceptional resource for checking out electronic books such as Colonel Milburn's, or to download past and present JSOW monographs through the JSOW Press. And of course, you can always check out our upcoming courses and events on our website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. This series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University, and I want to thank everyone for watching today.